Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for the NCAA President's Press Conference. Joining us today is NCAA President Mark Emmert, Harris Pastides, University of South Carolina President and Chairman of the Division I Board of Directors, and Joe Castiglione, University of Oklahoma Athletic Director and Chair of the Division I Men's Basketball Committee. And with that, I'll turn it over to President Emmert.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm sure you have lots of questions. There's certainly all manner of things going on this very exciting time. We want to make just a few quick comments, and then we can get to your questions right away. First of all, for me, it's great fun to be back in Houston. This was the first Final Four the site of the first Final Four that I participated in as president of the university, and it's been, of the NCAA, and it's been a fascinating 6-year intermittent period. And the piece of that transition that I'm most pleased with is that the role that student athletes play in the oversight and engagement of the NCAA, the ability of student athletes today to gain access to educational experiences and the success that they're having, the resources that are being committed to student athletes and the opportunities that they have to enjoy those resources are significantly greater today than they were 6 years ago. In fact, I would clearly contend that student athletes right now are in a much stronger, more successful position than they were in that short time, and that's a very, very good thing. I'm proud of what the member universities and colleges have done to achieve all of that. They've taken on a number of very important and complex issues, always keeping their focus on academics and fairness and the well-being of our student athletes, and those three things are the hallmark of what these two gentlemen to my left have worked so hard on. And with that, I will turn to President Pastides for a moment. He's been a leader in the association throughout most of the changes that we've seen over this time period, and Joe Castiglione, both in his role at his university and in in the Basketball Oversight Committee and the rest of governance, has had a huge role to play in all that we've been able to get done over the past handful of years. President Pastides.
Well, thanks, Mark. Let me add my words of appreciation to the City of Houston, the Mayor, the City Council. I think this is going to be an exciting and maybe one of the best Final Fours ever. I'm particularly happy to be at NRG Stadium, where Bob McNair's Houston Texans play. Bob is an illustrious alumnus of the University of South Carolina. I spoke to him a couple of days ago. He said he's excited to see what basketball will look and feel like in this magnificent football stadium. As Mark mentioned, job one for the D1 board and really for the entire association is the well-being, the academic well-being of our student athletes. We've made a lot of progress, although we've got more progress to make. I would point particularly to increasing the requirements for the academic requirements for becoming a Division I student athlete. All of the other investments that we're making in academic student progress, the APRs are increasing. At my university, they're the highest ever, and across the Division I, the graduation rates are the highest ever. I'm particularly pleased that the Board of Governors recently released $200 million to Division I schools that are expressly targeted at well-being of student athletes. That's the only place that you can spend that money on, is on the well-being of our student athletes. Right now, I would say, and what we're looking at is the time demand issue. The board is very committed in January when we go to our convention to promulgate new rules. And I'm particularly pleased that the Student Athletic Advisory Council, or SAC as we call it, is actively engaged in recommending to our board what changes are needed. I know some people were disappointed we didn't make the changes last year, but I think the D1 board's viewpoint is we'd rather get it right than be too quick. So it's an exciting time to be with all of you, looking forward to some great basketball, and proud to be part of this association.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and good to see every one of you. I come here as chairman of the NCAA Men's Basketball Committee, and obviously also I'm the athletic director at Oklahoma, one of the participants, but that's not my role today. I just want to express on behalf of the basketball committee. First of all, our gratitude to the City of Houston, Doug Hall and the local organizing committee, the countless volunteers that have been involved in preparing for this iconic event for probably 18 months or more. You know, it's been a while since they were awarded the bid, but they've certainly been actively working on the process to host this weekend. I also would like to extend our thanks to the University of Houston, Texas Southern University, and Rice University. The first time that 3 institutions have actually come together to collaborate to host a Final Four. If you don't mind, I have to just mention it's a little bit nostalgic in a sense for me, because I don't know that I could have fully imagined sitting here in front of you and being part of this incredible process when I was starting my career back in 1979, probably 4 months after Magic Johnson and his Michigan State Spartans and Larry Bird and his Indiana State Sycamores thrilled us all with one of the most memorable Final Fours ever. But I was starting my career just about 3 or 4 miles from here at Rice University. And at that time, it wasn't so far-fetched to think about a basketball game in a football stadium. After all, Houston had played UCLA over here at the Astrodome. But to think about coming back here, part of a Final Four, even with a team in the Final Four, being directly involved in the process to help initiate everything related to the Final Four is quite mind-boggling, but very, very exciting. And I can't tell you what a personal and professional privilege it is. And I want to extend again our sincere thanks to everybody that has been involved in bringing the Final Four here to Houston. We're excited to get basketball underway right here at NRG Stadium.
Okay, thank you, Joe. At this time, we'll open it up for questions. We have individuals with mics. When you are recognized, please state your name and affiliation. First question.
Mark, Luke DeCock, Raleigh News and Observer. The NCAA obviously took a role in last year with the objection to RFRA in Indiana. You've expressed similar objections to HB2 recently in North Carolina. I'm curious, with the bid cycle for men's basketball coming up over the next 7 to 8 months, is that going to play a role in whether North Carolina will or will not continue to host NCAA basketball sub-regionals and regionals?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, it's really important to note that for higher education, for the universities and colleges that are members of the NCAA, diversity and inclusion is one of the benchmark values that every one of those institutions adheres to. And so this is an issue of great importance to us. The RFRA law in Indiana had the double importance that was also and is also the home of the association, and so it's our point of employment. So we have around 500 employees who live and work there, and so it was even more poignant that we deal with it last year. What the membership has done with the leadership of Harris and the rest of the Board of Governors has been to be really clear that the experience that our student athletes, the teams, the universities, the fan base have in any one community is a consideration in where we determine to play these games. And so in that context, as I've made clear in many places and here in Texas, and indeed I chatted with your governor about this, it will most certainly be one of the variables that's considered as the committees make these decisions. It simply has to be. It's far too important to all of our member schools.
Next question.
Hey, Mark. Jeff Gravely, WRL-TV. The slogan at the Final Four is "The road ends here." I know there are a lot of North Carolina fans, coaches, administrators, and those outside of their fan base who want to know what's the end of the road, when is the end of the road in their investigation?
Yeah, obviously a very, very complex circumstance. I'm not going to comment on the nature of the case itself. It's been moving along very well. The university's been very cooperative and will be at a place where they can issue, my staff can issue allegations or a notice of allegations in the very near future. But other than that, it's premature to say specifically when that'll occur, but they're certainly getting to the end of the road on it.
Greg Logan of Newsday for Dr. Emmert, right here.
Sorry.
The investigation at Syracuse has already been completed. You've handed out the sanctions. As you look back on it, you know, that was an investigation that took several years and involved some very serious academic malfeasance, to say the least. And so putting them in the field this year, do you have any reservations about that, sending a message that says it's okay to do that because after a brief absence from the tournament, you'll be right back in?
Yeah, sure. I understand why, you know, optically people have a lot of questions around all that. It makes perfect sense that they might. But, you know, the reality is that the Committee on Infractions handed down, which is a group of individuals from the membership, as you know, handed down their sanctions on Syracuse University. The university dealt with those sanctions, and this group of young men that are playing right now had nothing to do with any of those violations. So from the committee's point of view, Joe's point of view, and the committee's point of view, their job isn't to determine who's eligible or not. That's up to the members to make that determination, and they saw Syracuse as having responded appropriately to the allegations that were against them and having dealt with the penalties that the membership imposed on them. So we've got a team that's playing right now that, again, had nothing whatsoever to do with those sanctions, and they should be allowed to play. It shouldn't impact these young men. That's what the judgment of the membership was, and I support it.
Mark, I saw a document recently where your general counsel was quoted as saying that if the NCAA, if your amateurism rules were seriously in jeopardy by the courts on antitrust grounds, that you would go to Congress and get your quote-unquote constituents, i.e. athletic directors, coaches, and university presidents, to get Congress to pass an antitrust law for the NCAA. Is that, in fact, the plan?
No, it's not at all a plan. The reality is, you well know, Joe, because you reported on it, is that there are a number of lawsuits that are out there right now that are charging antitrust violations against the NCAA. We have had one ruling in the Ninth Circuit that indeed did say that there were antitrust violations only up to the extent that there were constraints on students being students and supported as students, not as employees. And then there have been a number of rulings at the circuit level and below that have said the opposite, that indeed our rules weren't antitrust violations. So the point is that the state of the law is equivocal right now. We're discussing with the board and debating within our membership whether or not to take an appeal to the Supreme Court. But at some point, it may well be that we wind up with a case in front of the Supreme Court to ascertain what the ultimate state of the law is and what the Supreme Court thinks that collegiate sport should look like in America. And then we'll see where that goes. And right now, there's not a plan to go before Congress.
Dan Wolkin, USA Today. Mark.
Hey, Dan.
This is also for Harris, I guess. A lot of talk recently about transfers and whether schools, should be arbitrarily putting restrictions on transfers. When autonomy was passed, there was a lot of talk that there needed to be an urgency to get this done. Some people I've talked to think that maybe the autonomy group wants to let the clock run out so that they can take it instead of, the larger Division I governance. Where does it stand, and why does there, at least from externally, not seem to be any urgency on actually doing something about transfers?
Yeah, let me answer, and then Harris can add in. And Joe may actually want to weigh in on this one, too. I don't think at all well, first of all, there is a deep sense of urgency. I just came from the NABC executive board meeting. The issue of transfer rules, whether it's for undergraduates or graduates, is one of the most hotly debated and discussed, I think, in sport right now, whether it's football or basketball. The challenge is it's really hard to figure out a right way to resolve this issue. There's opinions on pretty much every side of the debate, again, whether it's graduate or undergraduates, and now it's complicated by the fact that there have been a couple of class action lawsuits filed against the existing rules with undergraduates. So it isn't so much that one group wants to settle it and another doesn't, it's that it's hard. It's a very tough one to find what the right outcome is. As I said, everybody's got opinions. I certainly have mine, but the membership is addressing them. There's an active debate going on right now, and will continue to be at this upcoming meeting this next month with the Division I Council. It'll be debated all through the course of the summer, and I have to tell you, I don't know exactly what the outcome will be, but don't hear the lack of a final resolution as a lack of keen interest. Quite the opposite. Harris?
Yeah, well, just briefly, it's a very, very important matter. The council is studying it now. We're going to hear back from them in the near future. Personally, I think we've got to do something about it. I would like to guard against the extreme, on both ends, by the way, of the curve, if you will, the extreme actions of preventing students who, for good reason, be they athletic or non-athletic, want to go to a different university. I think they should be allowed to and encouraged to. On the other hand, we don't want to promote the miscreant coach, if you will, who wants to get rid of a kid and say you ought to go somewhere else when in fact they're thriving as a student possibly, if not as an athlete. But it is complicated. If it were just a simple matter of saying just throw the door wide open, we would have done it already. So we're going to, it's a priority for the board, and I think you'll see some action on it in the next few months.
Joe, do you have any thoughts or opinions on it? I don't want to put you on the spot. But.
No, having experienced every aspect of the transfer rule, whether a student athlete is transferring or trying to transfer within the conference, outside the conference, coming from another institution, transferring to our institution, someone who has signed a national letter of intent and there's a coaching change before they enroll, the graduate transfer. So having experienced all of that, I do know that while there are certain philosophies that hold true in the vast majority of cases, they can't always hold true in every single case because of the sometimes the complexity or the uniqueness of the case itself. And we even are still managing a transfer of a non-recruited walk-on student athlete and who has been entangled into the intra-conference transfer rule. So I do think that while it is challenging to find a better place for our membership, I do think that there is a way to make it possible for student athletes to consider reasons why they are at a certain institution and why they should stay or why they may be better moving on to another institution. But I do go back to the experience of having to deal with those on a case-by-case basis and trying to make the decision that quite candidly is in everybody's best interest, including the student athlete. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions along that line.
Eddie Pels from AP. I just saw a little news item that DraftKings and FanDuel were suspending their college activity. I wanted to ask you what the thinking was behind that negotiation, and also, if I can just directly ask you, do you think daily fantasy is gambling?
So let me answer it in reverse order. First of all, I don't know whether it is or is not gambling per se. That's up to individual states or the federal government to determine. We know that under the rules of the NCAA, we label any game, including a fantasy sport game, in which there is an exchange of things of value as sports wagering, and therefore against the rules of the NCAA and the bylaws of the NCAA. So our approach from the very beginning has been not to get embroiled in what the legalities of that are. That's for somebody else to participate in, but we have been steadfast from the very beginning Indeed, when the first, in this last fall, when the first, I don't know what else to call it, but deluge of advertising hit the marketplace for these two companies, I and the 10 commissioners from the FBS conferences wrote a letter to both of those companies asking them to cease and desist games that involved student athletes. Right after that, I met with, my team and I met with the leadership of both of those companies, engaged in conversations with them, made clear the fact that we don't think that these games, these activities should involve student athletes, whether it's college or high school or Little League or anyone else, that if they want to do it with professional sports and the professional sports leagues want to work with them, that's between them, not us. We've continued to make that case. We've worked with individual state legislators and legislatures across the country as individual states are trying to set up regulatory regimes to say, fine, if that's what you want to do, that's your business, but carve out student athletes from these contests. State legislators are very, very amenable to that. Every place we've met and talked to them, and we continue to talk all along with both of these companies and also with the smaller companies. You may have noticed that an association of the smaller daily fantasy sports businesses also just announced that they would work toward getting legislative carve-outs for college sports and high school sports in these state legislation. So I'm delighted that FanDuel and DraftKings done this. It is a very good step forward, and we hope that collectively we can get colleges, high schools, little leagues, whatever, anything other than professional sports out of this arena.
Mark Ralph Russo with the Associated Press. I want to spin it back to the North Carolina issue. There are states in the process of considering either similar religious freedom laws, or in the case of Missouri, I believe it's possibly trying to amend its constitution by vote to put in similar laws. Is there anything that you or the membership could do to sort of actively engage in thwarting this movement towards these type of laws before they're enacted, or is it sort of a reactive position that you'll be in where you'll see if the law passes and then we'll make a decision on what to do?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Harris Pastides to respond also, because the Board of Governors so far, which is the ultimate oversight committee that Harris sits on, has not taken the position that we should proactively go on and lobby one way or another on these issues, but to express the great concern that we have as they're working forward, and that these laws are, depending on the circumstance, it's of course very complicated. There's many, many different kinds of laws, and there's lots of nuances to them, but that in some cases they're really inconsistent with the values of higher education. Remember that the NCAA is an association of 1,100 colleges and universities, and there's a huge diversity of institutional missions and political values that are represented by that membership as well. So what we have been doing is stating the case very clearly, what does or does not seem consistent with our values as laws have been working their way through the process. We took a position in Indiana this last year, for example, where there was consideration of a number of bills, one of which would have changed the civil rights laws to include LGBT protections, that we were supportive of that. We were very supportive of it, but again, Indiana is also where our employees live and where we recruit to from all around the country and beyond. So we're trying very hard to be situation specific, to represent the views and values of intercollegiate athletics and higher education aggressively, and to make people understand that we think that some of these laws are movements in a direction that are not supportive of what we stand for, and make it very, very hard, if not impossible, for us to operate in those states or those municipalities.
I do think the membership is inching toward a more proactive stand on this issue. Mark said it well, though. It is a consideration for choosing locations for postseason competition. To try to be more proactive, I think, is only commensurate and compatible with both the NCAA core values, but also the values of the vast majority of all member institutions. So I think we But to answer your question, I'm sensing among the membership and on the board a greater interest in making our viewpoints and our values more widely known. Now, how that plays out, on Main Street around the 50 states, we'll have to wait and see. But I think it's something that is a very, very important issue for us all.
Matt Norlander with CBSSports.com. Mark, I want to ask you something, but for proper context, I'm going to quote Jim Boeheim, what he said earlier, and then I'll ask you the question. He said, cheating to me is intentionally doing something. Like, you wouldn't want to get this recruit, you arranged a job for him, or you went to see him when you shouldn't, you called him and you got an edge in recruiting. That's cheating. I think if something happens that you're not aware of and it doesn't really affect a recruit, I don't look at it the same way. He basically was standing up for what he had done and what had happened at Syracuse was not cheating. Do you agree with what he has said?
Well, look, the Committee on Infractions looked at the facts in that case, and it was a voluminous set of data. It took far too long for all of the information to be collected and gathered. I think everybody agrees with that. But when the data were put in front of a Committee on Infractions, this is a body of members of the members of the association that aren't paid employees of the NCAA. They're conference commissioners, they're athletic directors, there's a former Attorney General of the United States, former university presidents. It's a cross-section of the membership. When those folks looked at the facts, they reached the conclusion that indeed violations of our rules and bylaws had occurred, and they imposed sanctions consistent with their view in that behavior. So, I'll let Coach Boeheim define that how he wants to, but the committee determined that these were clear violations of the rules, and that therefore it warranted some pretty significant sanctions, and they were imposed.
Follow up here. You're kind of relying on what the committee did. So are you saying that you agree lockstep with their definition of what cheating is? I'm trying to get your specific opinion to what Boeheim has said.
Yeah, sure. I have enormous confidence in the Committee on Infractions. I think that process works remarkably well. It's the closest thing you're going to see to a jury of your peers model for as broad an association as this one that includes a wide collection of institutions and members. So I have complete confidence in what that body did in this case.
Next question back here.
Hello. Art Chansky, WCHO Radio. Dr. Emmert, thank you for your explanation on the first Syracuse question regarding eligibility. Considering what you said and how the Penn State case washed out, is it a fair assumption to say that the NCAA is out of the business or doesn't want to be in the business of sanctioning present athletes with no eligibility issues for transgressions that have happened in the past? Is that a fair assumption to say that that's kind of the way it's going to be moving forward?
I think that in talking with all the members of the Committee on Infractions, talking with athletic directors and university presidents and everybody that I've been around in college sports, no one ever likes imposing sanctions on students who had little or nothing to do with whatever an infraction was. They don't do it gleefully, they do it very, very regretfully. Nonetheless, having said that, it's also an agreement among the majority of members of the association that postseason bans can serve as an effective deterrent. There are few things that universities, coaches, athletic departments dislike more and feel more sanctioned by than a postseason ban. So the membership has not, I want to be really clear, the membership has not said we're out of the business of postseason bans. I'm going to come back to Syracuse in just a minute, but they certainly don't like the fact, and they would love that student athletes who may have had nothing to do with an infraction are being punished or in some way handicapped. I think that the members of the board, the members of the Division I Council, the Committee on Infractions will continue to debate and discuss whether or not it makes sense to impose those kinds of postseason bans. It's a very difficult, hard sanction for people to levy. Having said that, in the Syracuse case, the difference is that I want to be really clear. The Syracuse was sanctioned at the level that the Committee on Infractions imposed the sanctions. They served their time, if you will. They did all the things that the committee asked them to do. They appealed to another committee, an appeals committee, that reduced some of the sanctions on Coach Boeheim. But other than that, or changed the way those sanctions played out, other than that, they did everything that they were called upon under those sanctions. So that their team should participate in postseason play at this stage is perfectly sensible and a natural outcome of them serving through those sanctions. So they're quite different issues in that sense.
Dr. Emmert, I'm Mark Tracy with the New York Times. I think in the past year we've seen a trend of some of the most prominent athletes kind of staging protests for various reasons, obviously most prominently at Missouri, but even at Oklahoma in a kind of different sense. There was a player protest around a year ago. I understand the NCAA's general stance toward unions, but I'm wondering, is that stance driven primarily out of opposition to the notion that athletes would be identified as employees, or would you be opposed more broadly to any sort of kind of, call it what you want, a conglomeration of athletes who can kind of meet amongst themselves and negotiate with the university, even if it's over things like, well, we're upset about something on campus and we may not want to play, that kind of thing. And I'd be interested actually in Joe's perspective on that as well, as someone who dealt with that situation.
Yeah, and it might be useful for President Pastides to respond as well. I think you're commingling a couple of really different issues. I see where you get them together, Mark, but the notion of athletes as employees who are unionized to negotiate for pay and benefits like any employee does is to me, now I'm speaking more as a recovering university president, is dramatically different than a group of students expressing their views and opinions on a social justice question. I'm fully in favor of student athletes having lives that are as much like the rest of their student body as they can be. Now that's difficult in some cases because of the time commitments they put in and a variety of other things, but in terms of their ability to and their personal desire to participate in social action or in public debates or policy debates, I think they ought to be able to do that just like any other student on a campus, and I would want and expect that of my students. And so I've been very supportive of students doing those things. If it is an issue where a group of student athletes have concern about treatment of student athletes or some other issue around athletics, then I most certainly think that those students ought to have a voice and a forum within which they can be heard, whether it's with their coach or whether it's inside the athletic department or any other venue inside the university. And in fact, every university that's in the NCAA and college has a student athlete advisory committee. They have organized student organizations inside the athletic department so that there's a vehicle by which that can occur. And then every athletic department, and we got a number of athletic directors here I see, they all try to keep open lines of communication so they know what their students, athletes need and what their concerns are. But I would too like to hear what Joe has to say and Harris on this point.
Well, let me add that student athletes must have voices, and I absolutely encourage them to be organized, if you will. We do have, as Mark said, a student athletic advisory council. They meet with the AD all the time and with me less frequently. They are concerned about big issues. They're concerned about the nation. They're concerned about sexual assault. They're concerned about social issues, and they have a right to be heard, and they should be heard. And I think in that context, we teach all of our students to be heard and to be civically engaged. Why not student athletes? I think on the other side of things, though, when you talked about unionization, that's totally a different thing. I remember hearing a story about Bill Walton, who he came back. He was, of course, playing for Coach Wooden and wanted to grow a beard. Coach Wooden said, not having a beard. And Bill Walton said, I'm going to go protest that. He said, "You go right ahead." And he went upstairs and found a barber, shaved his beard after he didn't find any recourse, and came back because he wanted to be on the team. So I think there's a lot of different ways to look at this topic, but student athletes absolutely need to have a voice, on as big of a voice as every other student on campus.
I'm often asked, about that very issue, and like it's a surprise, that the student athletes now have a voice. And I say, shame on you. Maybe it's the first time you've noticed, but the student athletes that I know have had a voice for as long as I've been in this business, and people I've worked around and people I've worked for, and certainly since I've moved into the leadership role, have always tried to engender ongoing dialogue with student athletes so they feel completely comfortable in expressing concerns, whether it's their own personal concern, Mark, or something that they're representing on behalf of other student athletes. And when we have certain situations on campus, like the one we encountered a year ago, it was a shock to all of us when it happened, but I'm very grateful that the student athletes joined with their fellow students to try and more clearly understand what the best path was. First, to bring the right kind of attention to the core issue or related issues, as well as what they were going to do going forward. They wanted to use it as a teachable moment for others. And it wasn't the easiest thing. They had so many different feelings and thoughts, some they had never had before, and they didn't understand exactly the right way to express it, but they knew one thing, and they knew it could be expressed in a very safe and secure environment. And I really can't say enough between what our president, David Bourne, did to immediately address the situation that developed to the way that he and other members of the administration and the faculty were right there, shoulder to shoulder with every one of the students to try and openly discuss what next steps should be taken. And then moreover, to make sure when the plan is put in place, there's follow-through. Even to this day, we have an even more engaged campus. People are talking about ways to improve cultural experiences, to improve opportunities, to make even more visitors on our campus feel welcome. So it's a very active engagement, not just something that happened and then the page was turned and now people are on to another thing. So even though we might have the presence of open dialogue, it's a consistent focus for us to always, if you will, encourage more conversation so people feel comfortable bringing things forward, so they don't get to that point in those cases of feeling like a protest is their last resort. Hopefully those conversations have been rich and ongoing to try to find best resolutions for everyone. And that doesn't mean always saying yes to the requests, but educating people on the options that might exist. And sometimes just the dialogue is the vehicle to working all of that out.
One of the other things, Mark, that has occurred just in the past 18 months is at all of the various levels in the decision-making process in Division I now, Division II and III have had this previously. There's now students that are sitting in each of those bodies, right up to the board of directors that are voting members of those bodies now. There had been a lot of engagement and discussion with the student athlete advisory committees before that, but Harris and his colleagues added voting not just voices but votes to each of those bodies. And it's for me, it's fun to watch the students sitting in those meetings and having a very open, active debate with university presidents, and they hold their own just fine. It works really well.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Mark, Chris Carlson from Syracuse Media Group. A lot of people have talked about the presence of Syracuse and UNC here and noted that the risk of breaking rules seems well worth the reward. I wondered if you think the current penalty structure is at all an adequate deterrent and if it's a concern of yours.
Well, it's always a concern of ours that the rules that the members have put in place strike that right balance, between being deterrents from behavior that nobody wants to see to also being too punitive and impacting students, for example, that didn't have anything to do with it. I would disagree with those observations that people have. The fact of the matter is Syracuse, as I've said several times now, went through an exhaustive process. It went through a hearing on infractions. It dealt with the sanctions that were put in place. And this current group of student athletes had nothing to do with those sanctions, and they happen to be a very good basketball team. And I think to conclude from that there was no impact on the university is simply wrong. I think that they disagreed at that time, and I think they would disagree today that there were no penalties that were inflicted on them. And then, of course, the UNC case, as I just said earlier, we haven't even gotten to a place where there have been allegations delivered to the institution. So we can't make any comment, observation about them one way or another.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for being here.